So I think we should carry on. Is that all right? Is there anybody dying for a break? I mean, do go and have a quick break if you want. But shall we carry on? Yes? Great. Okay, so thanks so much to that panel. And I'd like to welcome the last conversation of the day of this and this format. We've got Andrew, Potts, Katharine coming back on to join us, Beadie, Finzi, and Emily Wanja. Woo! Fantastic. So panel greetings, internal greetings. I'm the moderator for this panel, and it's in a way it's going into the heart of some of the real difficulties that we face. We've heard so much about things that are happening on the ground, that with shared values, shared purpose, stories that are happening really intimately and locally, which are absolutely fundamental to growing this movement. And then we've heard about how this movement is growing into these really critical, very nourishing networks all over the world, both very locally but also globally. So what's missing? And this is a really important conversation here at COP, because COP is a policy context. It's a political context. It's an economic context. And so what is missing? Why are we failing? And so we've got this group of people who are all going to bring their perspectives on it. I'd just like to, first of all, I'd like to really welcome and celebrate Andrew Potts. Who has done so much to build this particular network, the Climate Heritage Network, which is punching so far above its weight right now, with integrity, with truth, with huge humility. Only somebody who has those characteristics and brings that degree of authenticity and highly intelligent approach to this would be able to build this network. So Andrew, we are absolutely honoured to have you. Then we have the wonderful Katharine, who you've already heard from, works at Culture, also in a very tricky context at UNESCO, doing some really important work there around civil society and bringing civil society to UNESCO and UNESCO to civil society. ICOM, sorry. ICOM, sorry. Yes. Then we have Beadie Finzi, who is the foundation director of Doc Society, and I'm sure some of you, maybe all of you, will know about Doc Society, the very important work they've been doing. A trailblazing documentary making film company, seeks to always reveal truths. They're very gritty, they're very edgy, they are brave documentaries. Tricky topics: climate, social justice, care, inclusion, and to share them with a global audience. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, will have seen Doc Society films. And finally, and certainly not least, Emily Wanja, who is the Global Community Manager of the Climate Story Unit at Doc Society, an award-winning storyteller herself, who champions justice issues globally, and in particular in Kenya. Brilliant movies such as The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. I'm sure many of you have seen that great movie. Yes. So let's moving on. Just culture and climate action follows many different paths, and I think we've got two questions for this panel. One is what frontline activists, many of whom we've heard from today, are going to need from our institutions, many of whom we've also heard from today. What institutions need from our activists? And the second question, I think, which is even harder, in order to create this collectively collectively shared transformative moments. In order to do that, we need to change the system of climate planning and policy that is failing to keep 1.5 degrees alive at the moment. Just a little thing, which is last year for COP26, Judy Bicycle did a sweep, a policy survey of cultural policy globally. And we found that there was only one ministry in the world that had a cultural ministry in the world that had a stated and formal commitment to meeting the 1.5 challenge within their cultural policy. One, and that was Argentina. Yeah, wow. So where are we? So cultural policy is in urgent need of fixing. And the great thing is that what we know is that the answers are there, the community is there, the networks are there, the stories are there. How do we reach into those crucial policy frameworks? Already Simon has said the toolkit needs revising, and yes, it does. So the first question is, how can we, as a community, work really well together, from the institutional to the individual, the network to the small NGO, to the grassroots, and then building that, how can we therefore affect policy? And I'm going to, if we can start with you, Andrew, if you can try and answer the question about how do we come together and collaborate.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alison. You know, this event, Art, Culture, Heritage COP27, is the result of a sort of accidental collaboration between the Climate Heritage Network and CultureCOP. But it really the collaboration that's resulted in marriage is sort of epitomized some of the questions that you're raising, and in fact, it was the inspiration for this session. We thought, let's let the world in on what we're experiencing ourselves and talk about it, because this Climate Heritage Network has largely sort of been representing cultural institutions, ministries of culture, regional heritage boards, local arts councils, networks of libraries, of museums, of monuments, of archaeology sites. You've seen this today. And there's this entire world, of course, being led by artists, creatives, filmmakers, poets, who are doing so much on the forefront of climate. And many of these types of folks are at the heart of CultureCOP. Now, these boundaries are porous, and people fit in more than one category, and more than one type is in more than one basket. But at some level, in some way, these kind of poles exist, and they're actually, to some extent, reflected in these two networks. And in planning this event, we were sort of reminded of something that we knew anyway, which is that often these poles, these groups don't intersect. And they don't even intersect in the climate space when they're both working on climate change. And so it was sort of the genesis of this panel. And so that's just a statement of the obvious, I guess. You asked, how do we sort of now that we've alighted on this issue and written it large, what do we do with it? And you know, what I have learned from the process of creating this event with CultureCOP is how potent and powerful and magical it can be when the various capacities and capabilities and perspectives that these different players bring to the table, when those are brought together in service of something. And so, you know, the first thing I've learned is that figuring out the answer to the question is even more important than I thought. It's not just nice. It would not just be nice if more disparate cultural actors were synergistic in their climate action. I actually think that's the way we're going to solve climate change, and that's a big thing. Solving climate change. It's not a nice to have. So it's central. The other thing the last thing I'll say is that it is easy to kind of follow into when looking, and this is a little bit of navel gazing in the culture sector, I realize, but when looking at this question of sort of independent creatives, independent filmmakers, independent artists versus the Ministry of Culture or the National Association of Monument Sites, it's easy to sort of fix in your mind this juxtaposition of sort of radical, fully committed grassroots activists versus sort of incrementalists, moderate, milquetoast, kind of go slow types. And I don't think this is the correct way to do it. I think lots of cultural institutions, lots of ministries of culture, lots of networks are full of radical climate activists, but their talents are being deployed in the service of policy, in the service of financial instruments, in the service of mechanisms. I don't think it's that their heart or their head is indecisive about climate action. I don't think they're moderates. I don't think they're weak on the issue. I think their modality is that particular one. I think there are also plenty of independent artists who are not putting their shoulder to the wheel of climate action. I mean, I don't want to just set up kind of false binaries, and I don't want us to misunderstand each other. That I don't have to be talked into the need for radical change because I'm in an institution. And I don't think so. Anyway, I think the difference between us is not always what we think the difference.
Me? I think first of all, hi. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Is that better? Super. Thank you. So I think on the back of what you just shared, I'm going to go straight into giving an example of how storytelling in itself is so powerful in navigating all the different spaces and forums past geographical areas to bridge the different gaps identified in both the question that you asked and the answer that you gave, which I totally agree with. So I'd like to give you the example of a documentary film called Thank You for the Rain, and you can have a look at it later when you have some time. And it's a film that we have been involved in at Doc Society for a long time, and to which I had the honor of working in as an impact producer. And it's a story of a small-scale farmer called Kisilu from rural Kenya. And so it's a co-production between Kisilu, the farmer, co-authored with him, and a filmmaker called Julia from Oslo. And in the course of 5 years, Julia follows Kisilu and his family every day, not every day, but over 5 years, observing closely how the weather, how the seasons, and how climate affect his life and his family on a very personal level. And so eventually that film was completed, it was released, and it premiered at CPH Docs. It's one of the biggest documentary international film festivals. It was acquired by a distributor, Outlook Films, and it went on to do a successful festival circuit. It had over 90 screenings all over the globe, over 80 community screenings, so it pretty much did well in the conventional distribution. But in addition to that, this film went on to have an impact campaign. And what that simply means is that we tried as the film team, with support from a lot of allies and partners, to see how could we use this film as a tool to drive real change. And so we went back to the community where the film was made, Kisilu, under the leadership of Kisilu, the protagonist in the film. Him and his community in his village made up, they have a community-based organization. And at the time, we only had the trailer, 3 minutes. And so we are screening this film and saying, what do you think about this film? Is it okay? Does it represent your truth? Did you agree with this representation? And immediately they just launch into the issues that they're like, okay, fine, we see what you're telling us, but it's nothing new. This is our life. And so we say, right, okay, so what can we do? If this film had a chance to change something, what would that be? And they share, what they would like to see. Issues to do with adaptation, access to water, access to information, access to climate smart information too. And so you can imagine we're filmmakers, right? And so this is the information that we're getting. And so we quickly realized that to answer or even to attempt to think of a solution to some of these questions, we need help. And so we realized that there are people who've been doing this work for such a long time in this work of education and adaptation and all of that. And so by the time we're done with the film and it's doing, its festival rounds and everything, we go back and we are screening this film and screening it in every forum, such as this one, and asking in the room, friends, this is what we're looking for. We need people who are experts in building earth dams, in adaptation and climate smart farming, because this is what we need to do. And so, long story short, through those kinds of screenings, the film was able to attract support and resources to actually build an earth dam, to start to transform the CBO, the community-based organization, into a cooperative, an impact campaign that has run for 4 years. And so this work has happened on the grassroots level, on the national, regional level, and on the global level. The only way this happened over that time, it's pretty much a short time actually, for the amount of work that film was able to do, was because of that story. It's because it was a compelling, it was a real, and it is still a real and compelling, beautiful story. And so that right there, and it's just one of the ones that we are involved in and we support at Doc Society. And one of the films that are being made by amazing and brave filmmakers out there. But it's just to give you an example of how that kind of radical collaboration could look like, and how our difference is actually our strength. And it's not really that difficult when you think about it. But I think, would all of this have happened like if we were going with proposals, knocking on doors, trying to book meetings to do a PowerPoint presentation? It wouldn't have. It was simply purely because it was this work, transformative, powerful, a work of art. So I just wanted to share that example just to try and answer that question.
Yeah, thank you for that excellent example, and thank you, Andrew, for complicating the question a little bit in a way that really makes me feel seen, actually. Because as I was sort of saying earlier on the panel, I kind of realized not too long ago that when it comes to climate action, you can do all the individual things that you want, and really the impact is not that great. But as someone who's worked in institutions, including UNESCO, as Alison mentioned earlier, really having the privilege to work inside those kinds of institutions, for me personally, is actually a requirement to try to be an agent of change within those institutions. And so, yeah, I don't know if I consider myself a radical climate activist, but I certainly believe in the power of institutions to make huge collective change, and that it takes individuals within them to start to change the conversation and rethink the way we do things and try to create the effect around you. And so with regards to ICOM, this is why we invited Hilda to our general conference, because it was a huge platform. We had 3,000 museum professionals who received that message, and really it did bring down the house. As our president mentioned earlier, we are going to be issuing a statement actually on the occasion of COP27 about activists going into the museum and using the museum space, but not to say, obviously we are concerned about the security and safety of collections. That is the core of what we do. But we also believe there is a huge imperative to let activists in, to listen to their messages and to do what we can from where we are in our jobs to help.
Where to go? This is. Thank you, and thank you for the complication of the question. I really, really appreciated it, and you made me reflect that Doc Society. Sorry. Thank you, Fahana. So we're 17 years young, and when we started out, we were definitely the rebellious kids who were doing things in spite of the institutions in our sector, the public service broadcasters, all the kind of, the film funds, because they were not delivering. And so organizations like ours, sister organizations, non-profits like Sundance in the States, have attempted, to make an intervention, to create resources, opportunities for passionately independent storytellers to do their thing. But of course, over time, and that's important work, but actually, to your point, Alison, when it comes to a systemic challenge like the climate emergency, yes, it's important to support independent filmmakers, but we also have an obligation to try and influence positively the broader ecosystem. And in our world, that means the film and television kind of machinery. Which, by the way, is not radical. And I love the idea that there are radicals in your organizations, because I can tell you they're not sitting in Netflix or the BBC. Sorry if there's anyone from Netflix or the BBC, but it's not. And so, yeah, I think we're riding two horses as an organization. I just want to hold that tension. We have to be able to speak to them, but also, inspire and support these extraordinary networks of independent artists. I'd love to come back to a few ideas around policy change, which I think in our world, I'd love to share. But I'd love to begin by just lifting up the lid on what's going on in our community over the last 3 or 4 years, because we don't just need more climate storytelling. We need just climate storytelling. We need justice-centered practice. We can't replicate the extractive harms of our practice again and again and again when it comes to this work. So in spite of the fact you know what I mean? It's not just more. It's the right films told by the right people, made in the right way. And there's a couple of really exciting things that are going on that maybe you wouldn't know if you weren't in our little, in our bubble. Over the past few years, there's been a protest movement, began as a decolonized documentary protest movement, which was literally manifest in physical protest and boycotts, critiquing how work was being made, who was making it, how it was being platformed. And it was an extraordinary kind of shot across the bows for all of us in this work. And a few years later, that has manifested into incredibly productive collaborative effort. There's this amazing group called the Documentary Accountability Working Group, and they're literally, co-creating a set of principles and values by which we should not only relate to the people we're working with, we're filming, but also our responsibilities to audience, rewriting the rules of our relationship to funders. I mean, it's so fascinating. It's tearing up all the kind of neoliberal capitalist paradigm about how work is made and saying, actually, this isn't fit for purpose for us now, for a justice-based practice. And the other amazing and positive and productive thing that has come out is a co-creation movement. And obviously, co-creation is not a new thing. I mean, it's been practiced by Indigenous and First Nation communities amongst, for years and years and years. But frankly, mainstream film and television has been a long time coming and figuring out that it should apply to us too. But it's thrilling. We now have teams all over the world, yes, Australia, yes, North and South America, but also in Europe, who are beginning to engage with this fundamental idea and these fundamental questions, which is, what is my right even to tell the story? What is the power balance between myself and the community that I'm working with? I mean, it's absolutely overturning everything that we do and how we do it, and it's brilliant. And we can't, culture, storytelling is essential to meet the climate crisis, but we cannot replicate it in the old modalities. And so I just wanted to share that's a piece of a little revolution happening just inside our world, which is essential to answering this question, because I don't think we can make the change we want to make politically, culturally, socially, unless it's truly embedded in those values.
Well, that was a brilliant conversation because it started with Andrew identifying the binaries that exist, that perhaps we're oppressing ourselves by making assumptions about ourselves. This is an opportunity, an invitation that perhaps we're just not meeting, right through to that incredibly brilliant example of how storytelling rooted in very intimate settings can have global impacts. And there's a template there for us all, I think, through to your experience, Katharine, of actually doing this and the comfort that you are getting through understanding and feeling this movement to support your work, right through to Beadie's let's really change the system, which of course is the heart of it. So a fantastic storyboarding, if you like, of where we need to go. However, you know, these ideas, Beadie's ideas, not fit for purpose, co-creation, we've still got a long way to go and we've got to do it really fast. I don't want to add that urgency in because that can itself be very difficult. But I'm wondering, listening to all of this, and everybody's landing in the same place. I suspect everybody in the room has landed in this place, and it's why you're here. Can it be more intentional? Because we do also, and that point that was made by Claire, in order to affect policy, we have to have the instruments of change that policymakers are going to hear, whether it's evidence, whether it's stories, whether it's the experiences that films, documentary, art actually provide in situ. Whatever that toolkit is, we need to deploy it, and we need to deploy it together. So this is a difficult question, but just to ask each panelist and anybody in the audience who would like to throw in their wisdom and their insight, how can we be more intentional? What is needed? And this goes back to Simon's question about revising the toolkit. And I'd like to start again. Perhaps I will do the same order. But is there anybody in the audience who would like also to contribute, just so that we can keep an eye on the time, has got some ideas of that? Is there anybody? Queen Quet does. Anybody else? Okay. Well, we'll start with the panel, and then Queen Quet, I'll pass it over to you. Okay.
Well, I love Beadie's example, and the phenomenon you're describing plays out across every dimension. So in heritage, for example, it's quite fashionable to say, and I'm just say, not do, to say that traditional knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing are the solution to climate change. But said by people from institutions that actually bring sort of an extractive, anthropological, folkloric approach to traditional knowledge. So their approach to traditional knowledge is to, at best, to document it ethnographically. Maybe, you know, it's sort of this helicoptering in to pluck some isolated piece of information that's going to be useful. But that's not how traditional knowledge is going to fix climate change. I mean, traditional knowledge is going to fix climate change by lifting up and supporting communities whose cosmovisions, whose values, whose knowledge systems have always stood in juxtaposition to the take, make, waste culture, the extractive economies that have given us climate change. And so the way cultural institutions support indigenous wisdom as a solution to climate change is by supporting sovereignty and land tenure and livelihoods for the indigenous communities, the local communities that have nurtured the knowledge systems that give us that critique of unsustainable ideas of progress. And so this is my point being that this is not the approach to traditional knowledge that lots of cultural institutions, museums, heritage boards bring to the topic. So how do we get them? They're in the place where they're talking about the idea, but their engagement is not. So how do we move the sector? How do we move these institutions into a position of being not even accomplices, but not even allies, but accomplices with the people that are critiquing these unsustainable ideas. And we, just to wrap up the question, we, the Climate Heritage Network itself, have thought a lot about these topics, and we came up with 3 approaches. And I'm going to say one sentence on each and then pass it. The first is that culture is a part of the solution to climate change, except when culture is the problem of climate change. I mean, human beings didn't, in isolation, give us anthropogenic climate change. We got it through values of waste and extraction. And so we have to be honest that culture is as much a part of the problem of climate change as the solution, but that doesn't mean that cultural voices are any less needed. In fact, more so. Who can help deconstruct and dismantle the elements of culture that are the problem of climate change better than cultural experts? So, I mean, but we've got to be honest about that. That's the first thing. The second is to nurture an art ecosystem, a financing and support system for the arts that is itself not extractive. And this is that point that you were making in the heritage context. It plays out in similar ways. For example, a lot of attention on greenhouse gas intensive cultural tourism as a driver of heritage. But I mean, that's part of the problem of climate change. Also, creative industries, where the creative industries turns out to be Hill and Milton, doing PR for climate denial. So we have to sort of make the art ecosystem itself more nurturing, and well, let me leave it at that. So we do have some of these suggestions about how to. Well, the last one is centering climate change. That and in our world, that often means a rights-based approach. When you've got the Dakota Sioux blocking the Keystone Pipeline in North Dakota, in South Dakota in the United States, they're expressing a cultural value of what they want done on their lands, and they're addressing, they're expressing a cosmovision, a value system, and that is a cultural act. And yet you don't find, and then that voice, that viewpoint, is not welcome, and so it is shut down, and that is a violation of cultural rights. It's human rights, it's environmental activism, a lot of things, but it is actually specifically and legally an imposition of cultural rights. And cultural institutions need to be a lot more awake about defending cultural rights. And as soon as you're defending the cultural rights of folks, you are in climate action.
Thank you, Andrew. And just to add, and before I pass on, that when we looked at cultural policies globally, almost all of them invoke cultural rights. And this inability to make that connection that you've just made so eloquently, Andrew, between cultural rights and climate and environmental rights, it's missing in action at the moment in our cultural policy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So if you ask me right now, maybe for me and my community, for instance, what does climate justice actually mean? I will probably, in the context of climate change, I will probably tell you that for me, the climate conversation has more meaning if I can see how the lives of our communities are actually going to be prosperous, and how actually climate justice can transform the lives of our communities from abject poverty. Because the conversation on climate, for me, makes no sense if we're not talking about poverty, which obviously I'm not going to go into details of how it even came to be. But then, what does that look like in different contexts, right? If then we are speaking to different communities and trying to understand how they interpret climate, how they talk about it, how they describe their experiences. Obviously, for a long time, we have used a language that has been, has excluded a majority from the conversation, and hence excluded them from forums and places where decisions are being made, decisions that concern them. Communities who right now are at risk and who are living in the front line every day, right? And so, yes, there's, even when we were coming here, someone asked the question, how come, most of the people who attend COP, they're going to go back home into air-conditioned offices, but the people who are gonna go back at the front line, they're not even in COP. And so I think we have a role to just listen, first of all, just really listen to one another, and be more tolerant, because everybody has got something to bring on the table. And so then how do we capture this kind of nuances, these different relationships with climate, with nature? Well, where I come from, and I keep saying this, we have a very intricate relationship with nature. It shapes our daily life, our spirituality, our rituals, everything that we do. How do I write that? I can think that the only way I can communicate that is through cultural tools, is through storytelling, right? And so that work too needs to be resourced. It needs to be resourced because we need these stories, these different experiences to be made by many people in different formats and be seen by as many people as possible. Because if climate action relies on all of us, then we need to get into that conversation. So how do we meet people where they are at? And which is the fastest way then to do that? And at this point, I'm convinced that we definitely need that cultural intervention to get there faster and to seed and root all of that in climate justice.
I'm not sure what I would add to both of those really good points, except that I think what we're talking about is work that actually, by nature, kind of takes a really long time. And obviously, we don't have that time. I was prepared to sort of share an example of the recent museum definition debates that went on within ICOM, our organization. It initially was meant to take 3 years, and I won't go into why it took longer than that. It ended up taking 6 years, but what we have now is something that was voted in by all of the members at like 95% or something like that. We took the time to really consult in a meaningful way, and it was just a lot of hard work. Not always hard work, but man hours, woman hours, human hours of meeting people where they're at, including every voice as much as we could, providing different platforms to do that, and consulting so that when the final result came down, it was not a surprise to anybody. Everyone recognized themselves in the definition that we landed on, which I'm happy to say includes words such as sustainability. Museums are sustainable, museums are inclusive, museums are diverse, accessible. All of this language is in the new definition, and that's the result of many years of work, some animated debate, but really a process that was inclusive, and that included everybody. So I don't think I've really answered the question on how to accelerate. I think it took us a very long time to get here, actually. It took several decades. Maybe we could even go back. It took hundreds of years for us to get to this point. And unfortunately, I think we just need to dedicate the time and the effort to making it better.
So in our community of film-based media, on one hand, I'm actually quite optimistic we can move quite fast. We've been mapping the field for about 2 or 3 years now, and we literally know of hundreds and hundreds of projects being made around the world right now from every kind of community, representing every kind of perspective around the climate emergency. And so on one hand, challenge that Doc Society gladly takes is, okay, literally how fast can we raise resources to direct to those storytellers as quickly as possible to get those films made, those podcasts made, those all of the different kind of narratives and their forms out and moving into mass markets. On the other hand, I begin to think more and more that simply kind of leading by example about what is possible and demonstrating that there's appetite. There's a mythology in our sector that climate storytelling doesn't rate, that people aren't interested in it. It's a total nonsense. I mean, and Doc Society is working so hard to counteract that by literally backing brilliant, award-winning, sensational, funny, clever, kind, fantastic works of journalism, works of art, which are successful by any definitional metric. So we're working to just overturn that position. But I do begin to think now, to move to scale as quickly as possible, we need to think about other mechanisms. And I suspect I'm in the right room for people who could help iterate what that is. But I mean, what about a quota system for all public service broadcasters? What if 10%, 15% of all output on screen was dedicated, had to be centered around the climate emergency, whether it's children's programming, news programming, whether it's documentaries, whether it's wildlife? Why not? Or a tax on the corporate streamers who are absolutely not going to program this work. They're not interested. They don't want to buy it. They don't want to commission it. They've said that, they're doing so. They're saying it explicitly. Well, that can't hold. That can't hold. They are dominating global media. The homogenization of global media as pertains to film and television is growing, growing, growing. And we may have no other option but to say, well, if that is your pattern, then we will tax you and we will redistribute those funds to the storytellers, to the regional cultural organizations who can fund this work. We've got to do something at scale now. And actually, I think there is a pathway to do it. We just have to, we have to think of the mechanisms. And I have a feeling that somewhere between quotas, the carrot and stick, quota, tax, I don't know, and probably the EU is probably the first place to try it, because there's the European Union broadcasters. You know what I mean? I think it's plausible, and I think we could move quite quickly to it. I think we have to move quite quickly to it.
Thank you for a really rich discussion. I'm going to No? Okay. We're actually going to move on then to the next stage of the